What's up, Wolfpack? Cole Gregg here, and today we are going to do a little rundown on the 2021 Ibis Ripmo AF. Now, this is a long-term review. I've had this bike for about 6 months. The last 2 months I've spent here in the Phoenix area smashing rock gardens, and back up in Washington shredding some of those wet, nasty roots that we have all come to love in the Pacific Northwest. So for our test, Ibis sent out the 2020 spec'd model. This was due to short supply because everyone loves mountain bikes right now, as they should. So what I'll be doing is referencing the 2021 specs, as we'll get into a little bit later in the video. And just a little preview, the 2021 spec gets a double thumbs up. Some really cool changes were made. So the 2021 Ripmo AF is a 147 rear, 160 front suspended bike. This will allow up to 2.6-inch tires and really does a great job of blending the category between trail and enduro. It's a little confused, but in the best way possible. Okay, so let's dive into some of those frame details. Keep in mind here, this is an extra large, and I'm gonna reference all the large specs because that is the bike that I would choose, and I feel that the market is most likely to accept. You know, this XL rode amazing, but I want to reference the size large specs as we do in the majority of our other videos. So the reach on the size large Ripmo AF comes in at 475 millimeters, while the size extra large is 495 millimeters. Now, if you've watched any of our other videos, you will know that that 475 mil reach is right in our wheelhouse of awesome. The stack height comes in at 629 millimeters. The chainstays drop in at 435 millimeters. The bottom bracket height comes in at 341 millimeters, and the head tube angle is 64.9 degrees. The size medium Ripmo AF comes in at 8.25 pounds with the DVO topaz. Now, our bike is spec'd with the upgraded option of the jade, which does add a little bit of weight to that. And you know, really with this style of bike, blending those lines, I think that frame weight is right in, like, it's that upper edge of heavy, and you do feel it on the trail, but I really don't think it holds you back with the capabilities this bike has. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is run you through the spec list, give you my ins and outs and my experiences with the current specs, and kind of molded to that 2021 spec. Now, not a lot has changed, but we will get into that here in a little bit. So to start out, let's touch on that DVO Diamond D1. Now, if you've watched any of my videos, if you hear me talk about suspension, I love to tune stuff, I love to fiddle, and I have a notebook, or actually a notes section in my phone where I'm keeping different settings for different trails just to maximize the ride. Now, the Diamond is of no exception to those adjustabilities. One thing that really sets DVO apart is the OTT system they used for that first inch of travel. Now, what this allows you to do is dial in your sag and your compression, and then fine tune that first little bit of travel to get it supple, OTT, off the top. Now, being a rider that likes a lot of ramp up, I'm usually either A, having to run maximum spacers, or have to, if there's no spacers available, bumping up that air pressure, which loses me a lot of that small bump compliance. And particularly with this Diamond, it is a little complicated to tune, I guess you could say. That OTT gives a different aspect of how you can tune it. Other than that, you know, the rebound, high speed compression, low speed compression is all pretty similar. The high speed compression on this fork does not have true clicks, so I've always suggested people to count by full rotations, you know, make 2 rotations, log, 2 rotations back the other way, that sort of thing. Overall, the performance of this fork on this bike, I think, was a match made in heaven. This being that kind of in-between trail enduro bike, really wants you to go fast, and I really like the way that the DVO products track. Now, moving on to the back, you can see here we have the coil shock, which is DVO's Jade X. This is another one of those interesting options where you have a little bit more tuning capability than, say, your standard clickers. So on this shock, there is a 3-position lever for fully open, midway, and the climb mode. Now, I rarely use climb switches nowadays. I guess when I do have my camera bag, I will put it in the climb mode just because I have an extra, you know, 30 pounds on my back. But with this shock, other than having rebound adjustments and that 3-way lever adjustment, you also have a bladder adjustment. So what this bladder does is allows you to fine tune the entire curve, giving it a more supple or a more firm feel. I generally like to run this shock really open and really soft, especially with a bike like this that does have a decent amount of progressivity built into the frame. Overall, the Jade X did an amazing job of controlling that rear end. Rock gardens, soft loam, it wanted more. The best way I can describe it is you kind of, like I've said with some other bikes, you do kind of forget you're on a quote unquote short travel bike. You know, at 147 millimeters, there's a lot of bikes out there that ride like less but have more travel. Really impressed with this DW setup by Ibis. All right, well, moving on, let's cover the wheels. Both front and back, you have a 29-inch S35 Ibis wheel set. This is a wheel set that is new to me. I've never ridden Ibis wheels before spending time on this bike, and they track really well. There's no weird pings. They are aluminum. There is a carbon upgrade option. This build does have the aluminum version. And I have nothing bad to say. You know, wheels are one of those things that I think if I get on a bad wheel set, I'll know right away. And something like this at this price point is a really good option. Ibis also covers the hubs on this bike. They are I would say equivalent to, like, say, the DT350, similar engagement, similar sound, and I would say maybe even a touch like bigger scope of engagement than the DT350s. And for me, I like a really fast engaging hub. So on some of the technical climbs on those short back pedals, there was a bit of a lag on getting that engagement. So that is something to consider if you do really value a fast engaging hub. So when it comes to tires, Maxxis covers the duties. There is both front and back Assegai 2.5-inch Exo Plus casing tires. On this bike specifically, I do have a DHF here in the back, and it has been used and abused with much love. Up front, that Assegai has held up great, and for me, the more time I spend on the Assegai, I really am coming to love it. It gives that better braking traction, I'd say, than that DHF, but the side lug traction is really there, and it's a really unique tire, and I think has done a really good job to catering to a different crowd in that Maxxis tire group offering. All right, next up we have the brakes. So on our 2020 spec model, it is offered with guide T's. Yeah, I know, guides. But great news, on the 2021 model, this bike is coming with the code RSCs with 200mm rotors up front and a 180mm rotor in the back. Now, my experience with the guides was rough, to say the least. I bled the rear 3 times and the front once. They just were not up to taking care of the braking duties for my riding style and what this bike is truly capable of. And as I mentioned earlier, there were some great changes that were made, and those code RSCs on the 2021 spec is an awesome change. Well done, Ibis. All right, well, keeping on the SRAM train, the drivetrain is also covered by SRAM. So on our test bike, we had the NX group set, and like also I mentioned earlier, one of the other upgrades is the GX on the 2021 spec model. Now for me, cranks aren't a big point of issue. Like, can't really tell the difference unless, you know, they're carbon, and it really does make the bike weigh a lot less. But this NX derailleur was okay. And I mean okay, it did the job, it shifted, it was kind of noisy, there's no clutch on it, and the shifter is just there, it's a shifter. The paddles are, you know, that weird kind of plasticky feeling, there's a lot of play. It doesn't like to be shifted when under heavy load on climbs. I was getting some severe lag even after tuning the derailleur many times, but happy to say that GX upgrade is very much welcomed, and I think it'll be a really good addition to the 2021 spec. So there you have it, the specs of the 2021 Ripmo AF. Now let's move into a little bit more of the riding characteristics. Let's go ahead and jump out on the trail, and I'll give you a little rundown while I'm climbing up one of my favorite loops here at Deem Hills. All right, welcome out to the beauty that is Deem Hills. It's about 15 minutes from my current home. Been a really good little loop to test out bikes on. The rocks are super loose, lots of golf ball to softball size loose rocks to test these bikes' climbing abilities. And man, does this Jade X track so good. I think that's the first thing, forgive me, I'm winded, I'll touch on is just how supple off the top that Jade X is. And when you need traction, it's all there. Just like up over those guys. But overall, for an XL bike, on paper, it feels long. Like, you look at the numbers and you're like, man, that's a big bike. And that's what I was expecting when I first got it. And after a few weeks, months rather, shredding on this thing, I've come to really enjoy the cockpit. Like I said, on paper, it looks big, but the cockpit for an XL is really comfortable. One thing that I think really contributes to that comfortable cockpit is the seat tube angle. Even with my daddy long legs and the dropper post way out of the seat tube. I don't feel like it's rear biased. I mean, that seat tube angle right here is spot on for a bike in this category. One thing to note is that I've found there is a little lag of engagement on the hub. So if you're in a nice cadence like we are now, you don't notice it, but as soon as you take a little break and try and re-engage back in, there's definitely a noticeable lag. All right, so here's that rocky, loose stuff I was talking about. Lots of golf balls, little steps. No problem. Oh man, getting some pedal strikes today. That really hasn't been a big issue for me, but for whatever reason today. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't call it a billy goat, but it'll get you up as much as your skills will provide. I haven't had much of an issue with the wheel lifting. I think that's due to that wheelbase and just overall length of this XL sized bike. So right here we have a somewhat tight corner, and obviously navigates that just fine, but with this length, both up and down, I noticed that you really gotta pick your line. Like here, I'm gonna take the wide line and not cut through, get down a gear, then cut in on the power. And it does just fine, but if you live in an area where there's a lot of tight switchbacks, this is a big bike. Again, we'll go wide, cut in, perfect. All right, welcome back. So now that we got the climbing out of the way, let's talk about how this thing goes downhill. And now, this was the first Ibis bike that I have ridden, but it is not the first DW Link bike that I've ridden. And I've actually owned several of the Pivot Mach 6s and a few other DW Link bikes. So I really do enjoy the characteristics that this DW Link offers, not only like we spoke about with the climbing, but for me, the cornering, predictability and traction that this bike has, especially with that Jade X, is amazing. There's a lot of flat, dusty, rocky corners here in Arizona, or specifically Deem Hills where this loop is. And I just could come into it with a little bit more speed, more confidence, knowing that I was gonna hook up and bash out the end of the corner. And to that point, once you get going up to speed, especially here, I noticed really how well that rear end tracks and how well it works through a lot of this chunk. I'm talking anywhere from little rock gardens like that to those kind of golf ball size rocks spewed about the trail. It tracks straight. Now there was quite a bit of cable rattle because the trail was so rough, but the bike was really composed. I guess the best way I could put it into words is when I'm riding it, I can kind of relax a little bit. I don't need to feel tense. It has enough travel that you have some leeway for errors, but at the same time, you know, you do want to pick your line and really push through that. I found that the more I dropped my heels, the more I was able to really pick up speed in some of those flatter sections where the rocks were super, super chunky. Throughout the entirety of my test, I kept checking frame bolts, nothing came loose, so happy to report that there. So when it comes to jumping with this bike, it's really composed. And being an XL, I did have to work a little bit on those side hits to really get the most out of it. It does, I would say, on that scale of planted poppy, it does fall on that planted side. But when you do want to get airborne, doing so it isn't that hard. It's not like you're not going to be able to hit jumps on this thing. It's a really good balance. So when it came to the tighter corners on this bike, I did feel that XL start to hold me back. Now I'm not super comfortable through technical tight switchbacks that we have here in Arizona, whereas up in Washington on more rooty, loamy terrain, I did find that it was easier for me personally in my riding style to flick the bike around. I definitely was struggling here and trying to pick my line to open it up and really get the most out of those corners. And with this bike, I found if I come in wide and center cut that corner and kind of square up the very end of it, that was where I had the most success and honestly the most fun too. I do want to touch back on the shock package with this bike. That DVO Jade X and the Diamond D1 were a match made in heaven for this bike. I think Ibis did a really good job speccing this model with that suspension kit. It really allows you to get the most out of the bike with confidence. And that's what I also want to come back to is being a 147 mil bike, it's not the biggest, it's not the smallest, but it does feel like it rides above its pay grade, especially with that coil out back. Now I would like to try it with a topaz because I really do like that shock, and I think that would actually help liven it up, you know, maybe throw some more positive spacers in there and really get that ramp up off the lips of jumps. So on some of the flatter terrain that I've encountered, I did find that at that, like, I guess moderate pace, I was hanging up, but as soon as I started really putting some power into it and getting the suspension on top of those rocks, it did smooth it out, and it wasn't like a, you know, a spring forward, but it did allow me to carry plenty of speed through those flatter sections of trail. Okay, well, there you have it, the 2021 Ripmo AF. This is a really cool bike, and if I was in the market, it would definitely be high up on my list, especially at this price point. I guess let's go over some of my overall likes and dislikes with it. Let's start with the dislikes. And I think a lot of these were changed, you know, the brakes, the dropper, those have all been upgraded, so that could be wiped off the table. I would have to say while it's a good looking bike, it's not the best looking. You know, in photos it looks really clean, but up close, that linkage is really burly, which me as a rider, I like that. I mean, when I'm riding the bike, I'm not looking at the linkage, and if it's burly and gonna hold up to the test of time, that's a big positive. And for that, I have to kind of put it in that in between of like dislike. You know, is burly linkage, that DW link setup gets the job done, but it doesn't look the prettiest in my opinion. Other dislikes, you know, there's nothing really that stands out on this bike that is a major dislike. You know, the riding characteristics at least. Some of the frame rattle with the cables was a little annoying, but made do. And if it were my bike, I'd actually put some of that foam housing in the down tube to quiet up those cables. Okay, well, let's move on to my likes about this thing. So I've already mentioned it a few times in the video, the suspension package, it's bomb-proof. Really, really enjoy it. Definitely, if you're setting it up for the first time, it's gonna take some getting used to. The cornering characteristics this bike has, the rides like more travel that it has are all big positives in my book. You know, the cornering with this suspension and this setup, and especially that front tire really shined. So that was a big plus as well to come with that Assegai right out of the box. As far as other likes, the upgrades. 2021 spec is baller. I mean, you're getting GX drivetrain, a bike yoke dropper, which is one of my favorite droppers out there, this suspension kit, a solid wheel platform that is still true. Like, it is not true after 6 months thrashing, and I'm good usually for about 4 months on a wheel set before I need to take it in and get it lined up. So props to Ibis for building the burly wheel. So who's this bike for? Well, it's a tough question. It's a bike that really blends the trail and enduro categories well. 147 mil out back, 160 mil up front. It allows you to go on those long pedals and to not shy away from some of those descents. If you're someone that really, really values the climbs, maybe it's not the bike for you. You know, it's burly, it's meant to be thrashed, and that's where I think this bike thrives, is when you really want to push the limit of what it can offer. And I would say, you know, if you are someone doing a bunch of shuttles or bike park days, it might not be quite there. But at the same time, you pick your lines right, and you'd be really surprised what this bike's capable of. So I would say this is a bike for someone that is looking for a do-it-all. We do tend to talk about this a lot, but I think it does things really well in both categories. While it might not be the best in each, it blends them really well, and the balance this bike brings to the table is great. All right, well, there we have it, the 2021 Ibis Ripmo AF. Really appreciate you guys taking the time to tune in and watch this video. If you haven't already done so, please hit that subscribe button for more content on the way. We have lots of stuff fun in the works as we are getting into that summertime riding season. Until then, we'll see you out on the trails.